Hello and welcome back. In the second section, I want to talk about some conventional theories of nationalism, and out of those, try to develop what are some of the basic assumptions of nationalism. So these theories will probably be familiar to most of you already. They're the touchstones that people use much of the time when they talk about nationalism. I want to review them briefly and try to pull out what is important about them or what may be less useful about them when we try to use them to apply them to concrete situations. The first one that I'm going to begin with is going to be Anthony Smith and his theory of ethno-symbolism. Now, Anthony Smith tries to trace the origins of nationalism and of national identity far back into history. He postulates that before recorded history, there existed human groups that were distinct from one another in terms of identifying factors. He calls those ethnies. They develop into ethnic groups and eventually develop into nations. And so it's to these that we trace the existence of nations today. And what makes nations so powerful then is the ancient roots that they have, the way that they express fundamental bonds between people. Now, there are some obvious problems with this explanation. One is anytime you say that what accounts for a contemporary phenomenon is something that happened before recorded history, then what you have produced is a theoretical approach that is unfalsifiable. There is no evidence that can prove that these ethnies existed in ancient history. There is nothing to prove that they did not exist. There's also a basic logical problem with this construction, and that is that if there were an infinite number of these mythical groups in pre-recorded history, why are there relatively few nations today? That is, we do not have an answer to the question of why some of them continued to exist, some of them did not, some of them transformed into nations, and some did not. What I would argue is that anytime somebody takes an observable contemporary phenomenon and then tries to project its existence back to the beginning of time, back to the time before recorded history, to make it look as though it is eternal and unavoidable and natural, then in that case the person is not producing theory. What they're producing is ideology. It is trying to take a fact that is observable and to say that it is consistent with nature or tradition or with something inescapable. This is a reason why I would suggest that it's a good idea to have a lot of reservations anytime anybody cites Smith as an authority on national identity and on nations. He's presented a theory that is fundamentally unfalsifiable, unprovable, and that has clear ideological purposes. So let's get to some, rather than prehistorical theories, some historical theories. And the first of those that I want to talk about is Ernest Gelner, who ties nationalism and the rise of nationalism to the rise of the modern state. For Gelner, the important thing about the modern state is that it brings together a variety of local identities under a national umbrella through things like a shared language, a shared administrative system, a shared educational system. And this is justified on the basis of identities which are at least in part created and imposed. One of the facts that's important for Gelner, for example, is if we want to take a national entity, or we regard it as a national entity now, like France. At the time of the French Revolution, only about 25% of the population of France spoke French as their primary language. The spread of French as a universal language of education, of exchange, of business and administration comes as a part of the construction of the modern state, the big project of the 19th and 20th centuries. So they created a national unit, and it was the political unit that created the national unit. And this is the basic principle of nationalism. That first point there that you see under Gelner is his famous definition of nationalism, a political principle which holds that the political and national unit should be congruent. And what matters about this is that it's tied to the development of the state in the sense that to create a national unit, it's necessary to create a shared language with shared rules that is regulated and codified for the purpose of precision. Without this, trade and administration are impossible. And to create, to put in place a set of feelings and symbols and images that allow for the shared experience of a mutual bond in the space of what is called the nation. That is to say, that nationalization, like other manifestations of modernity, is produces a homogeneous population, and this homogeneity is in large measure enforced. It is enforced through political and cultural and educational and similar institutions. The other element of this that is possibly important is that in order for the project of creating a political nation really to work, it's necessary to do things like to create a system of education in which all members of the population are educated to an equal level in the basic elements of nationhood, the language, the culture, the identity, and encouraged to share a common symbolic orientation. And this is a project that is subject to conditions which are often impossible to meet. The creation of a universally available educational system is a project in which nearly all states have failed to a certain degree and continue to fail. I want to turn next to the cultural dimension of this project of construction of a state. And this is articulated by Eric Hobbsbaum in his famous work, The Invention of Tradition. Now, for Hobbsbaum, what ties identities together is a set of shared symbols, images, and what might be called traditions. What's interesting about traditions is that it's very difficult. I would expect that none of us could really identify any tradition that is currently practiced that can be dated back, in the same form at least, more than 100 years or so. What Hobbsbaum argues is that national traditions are selected out of the diversity of cultural practices and images and symbols that exist in society and become national images through a process of publicity. If we want to take a trivial example from this country, we could ask about the monarchy in the United Kingdom and why the monarchy is tolerated, even though politically it is more or less irrelevant. And the answer that most people would give, you ask this question to somebody in a bar, they would probably say something like this, that the monarchy is the symbol of the permanence of the state, so that governments may change after every election. These can be transformed. These are fluid, and political orientations may change. But the one thing that is permanent is the country and the state, of which the monarchy is the embodiment. Now, what you could argue is that this is a perception of the monarchy that did not exist until the monarchy became politically inactive and irrelevant. At the time when the monarchs, the kings and queens, actually exercised the power of the state, they were politicians. And like every politician, they had supporters, they had opponents. So this image of permanence is a later construction, and it's a later construction that is based on a misinterpretation of the past, or in the formulation of Ernest Renan. Getting history wrong is part of being a nation. What getting history wrong means is taking particular elements of national culture and national identity and postulating them as permanent, of taking inconvenient elements of the national history and erasing or silencing them. So for Hobbsbaum, the symbolic framework of nationhood and national identity is a construct. It is a deliberate construct that is established through a political process. And what we are able to do with this insight then is then to look at nationhood and national identity not as coming out of nature or a permanent tradition or something like this, but as a project of politics. And this is where we are moved forward by John Bruli, who makes the argument that nationalism is a form of politics. It's a form of politics in which a group of people expresses a relationship to a state. It can be a relationship of loyalty to a state or of disloyalty to a state, or of loyalty to another state. That is, there are different types of national movements. There are separatist movements, there are reform movements, there are unification movements. What they all have in common is that every nationalist, every nationalism is a form of politics in which a particular group succeeds in contending that its particular interest, its self-interest, is the national interest. So to identify the interest of a group or of a class with the interest of the whole nation, and to argue, make an argument for its position in power or its ambition to attain power on that ground. Now, these are more or less the main conventional theories of nationalism. They're all descriptions of nationalism on some level. There is something that we could say all of these approaches to explaining nationalism have in common. First, the basic assumption behind every nationalism is that there are national identities, that people are, at least on some level of their lives, fundamentally a member of one or another national group. This is also a widespread folk belief. One of the answers that you're likely to give if anybody asks you the question, what are you or who are you, is to name a nationality. Of course, there are others, and this is going to become important in the next section. A secondary assumption is that people either need to be, if you assume that national identities are natural, awakened to their consciousness of being national, or they need to be educated and acculturated into it if you view the creation of national identity as a deliberate project. What we do with these theories is we move nationalism from the position of being an object of contemplation and consideration, something that you might encounter in the natural world, and instead look at it as a project, as something that is created and is built. Everything that is created and built can be created or built successfully or unsuccessfully, and this creates a set of problems that I want to look at in the next segment.